Let us begin in the quiet countryside of Kent, where soft rain often drifted across the fields and the trees leaned gently in the wind. In that green corner of England stood Hever Castle, surrounded by water, stone walls, and the steady habits of a noble household. For best sleep experience, please keep your screen unlocked. You can also download this video for offline play. In the early years of the 16th century, this was one of the places most closely tied to the childhood of Anne Boleyn. Her life would later be wrapped in rumour, wonder and sorrow. Yet it began in rooms shaped by ordinary rhythms. Morning light came slowly over the moat. It touched narrow windows, pale plaster walls, folded garments, polished cups, and the wooden chests that held a family's careful possessions. Servants moved before dawn. Fires were stirred, bread was set out, doors were opened, and the first sounds of the day rose into the stillness. For a child growing up in such a house, the world was both sheltered and watchful. There was comfort in routine, but there was also expectation in every lesson, every greeting, and every hour. Anne was born into a family that was not among the oldest and grandest in England, yet it was rising. The Boleyns were clever, useful to the crown, and very aware that advancement often came not through force, but through service, polish, and timing. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a man of ambition and skill. He spoke the languages of diplomacy, understood the gestures of court life, and knew how much could depend on being noticed by the right people. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from a more ancient and powerful noble line. Through her, Anne was linked to one of the great families of England, where rank, memory, and family pride ran deep. So from both sides, Anne inherited something important. From one side came energy, adaptability, and a hunger to rise, and from the other came noble blood, ceremony, and old aristocratic confidence. The exact year of Anne's birth has long been debated. Historians still move carefully around it, which feels fitting for a woman whose life would leave so many questions behind. What matters here is not one uncertain date, but the atmosphere into which she was born. England was under the rule of the Tudor dynasty, still young, still conscious of its fragile hold on peace, and still haunted by memories of civil conflict. Only a short time earlier, rival houses had fought for the English crown in the long struggle later called the Wars of the Roses. By Anne's childhood, those wars were over, but their shadow remained in conversation, caution, and the king's deep concern for stability. The king on the throne was Henry VII. He was careful, economical, and determined to secure the future of his line through order, marriage, and strong control. This was not a world that encouraged carelessness in great families. Children were raised not only as children, but as future pieces in a wider arrangement of alliance, service, and advancement. Anne was not an only child. She grew up with her sister Mary and her brother George, and together they moved through the household as siblings do, sharing lessons, spaces, and the quiet intimacy of family life. We cannot hear their voices now, but it is easy to imagine them in the passages of Hever. One might be laughing near a stair, another hurrying past a window, another pausing by the chapel door, while a servant called them back to order. The castle itself was not the enormous royal world Anne would later know. It was smaller, more intimate, a place of enclosed gardens, timbered chambers, and practical dignity rather than overwhelming splendor. There were stone fireplaces and curtained beds. There were benches by the walls, painted panels, prayer stools, and the muted glow of candles reflected in metal and glass. Outside, the landscape offered its own kind of education. A child learned the names of birds, the shape of seasons, the smell of damp earth, and the sound of hooves arriving over the road. Spring brought wet grass and blossom. Summer widened the fields, autumn filled storerooms and kitchens, and winter drew everyone closer to the fire and the chapel. In noble households, children were not left to drift through the day. Their hours were gradually shaped by discipline, by religion, by household order, and by the understanding that rank required training. Anne would have learned prayers early. She would have heard Latin in church, repeated familiar devotions, and absorbed the sacred pattern that ordered so much of daily life in Tudor England. Religion was not separate from ordinary existence. Bells marked time, feast days shaped the calendar, and the walls of every great house held some sign of devotion. A child like Anne would also have learned manners with great care: how to enter a room, how to bow, how to speak with respect, how to sit, how to sew, how to read the mood of elders. All of this mattered. Grace was not thought of as something light and decorative. It was a form of discipline, and in a world of rank and ceremony, it could open doors as surely as wealth. The education of noble girls in early Tudor England was narrower than that of boys in some ways, yet it could still be rich. Reading, music, needlework, household management, French, dance, and piety all belonged to the world Anne was entering. Her family, especially her father, seems to have valued learning and refinement. This mattered a great deal because it meant Anne's mind was not neglected, even in a society that often measured women first by marriage and lineage. At Hever, books were precious objects. A prayer book might rest beside a bed. A volume of moral instruction might be brought out for study, and letters arriving from court could carry the pulse of a much larger world. Children learned not only from books, but from watching. They watched visitors, clothing, manners, the order of meals, the handling of conversation, and the careful ways adults spoke when something important was at stake. Thomas Boleyn spent much of his life moving in circles beyond the walls of Hever. He served the crown in diplomatic roles, and his career meant that the household was connected to the changing world of England's court and foreign politics. That connection gave Anne something more than comfort. It gave her a sense, perhaps at first only faintly felt, that life could stretch beyond the moat, beyond Kent, and beyond the ordinary future expected of many girls. Yet childhood is often made of small impressions, rather than grand thoughts. It may have been the colour of a sleeve, the coldness of chapel stone, the sound of geese in the yard, or the rustle of wool in winter that stayed with her longest. At meals, the family would have eaten according to rank and season. Bread, ale, pottage, fish on fasting days, meat when available, fruit in its time, and the steady presence of salt, spice, and ceremony marked the table. A noble child learned how food arrived, who served it, who sat where, and what each detail suggested about status. Even comfort had structure. Clothing, too, taught its quiet lessons. Linen against the skin, wool for warmth, fitted sleeves, laced bodices, fine embroidery for special occasions, and carefully chosen colors all revealed the order of the household. Garments were costly and closely managed. They were mended, altered, handed down, brushed, folded and guarded, because clothing in Tudor England was not merely practical, but a language of rank. Anne grew up in a time when appearance carried meaning. To be neat, composed and well presented was not vanity in the modern sense, but evidence of discipline, family honor, and social understanding. In such a setting, the senses were always awake. Smoke from the hearth clung to fabric. Beeswax warmed in candlelight. Herbs dried in kitchens. Leather creaked. Dogs stirred in corners. And rain tapped on leaded glass. The world was quieter than ours in some ways, yet never silent. There were bells, footsteps, prayer, coughing fires, distant wheels on the road, and the low murmur of people whose lives were always shared with others. Anne's mother likely oversaw much of the domestic order that shaped these years. Great households depended on female authority, not only in child rearing, but in managing servants, supplies, linens, meals, guest arrangements, and the moral tone of the home. This kind of authority could be subtle and firm at once. A girl watching it would learn that women, even within limits, could wield influence through intelligence, self-command, and presence. And presence would become one of Anne's striking qualities. Later observers would disagree about her beauty, but many noticed her manner, her expression, and the lively impression she created when she entered a room. Those qualities do not appear all at once in adulthood. They often begin in childhood, in watchfulness, in sensitivity, in the habit of observing others before speaking, and in learning how attention moves. The Boleyn children also belonged to a family that expected movement upward. This does not mean their home was cold or joyless, but it does mean that affection and ambition lived close together. That was common in noble life. Parents loved their children, yet they also prepared them for use in a larger family design. England itself was learning to settle under Tudor rule. Henry VII strengthened royal finances, arranged marriages carefully, and tried to reduce the kind of disorder that had once torn kingdoms apart. The result was a strange blend of peace and unease. The roads were calmer, the throne more secure, and the court more controlled. Yet everyone understood that dynasties remained vulnerable. A king needed heirs. Noble families needed favor, land, and advancement, and all of them listened for shifts in fortune like sailors listening to the weather. Even from heaven, those wider currents could be felt. A royal marriage, a diplomatic mission, a birth, a death, or a noble quarrel could alter the prospects of families far beyond London. So Anne's childhood unfolded not in isolation, but within a living web of Tudor expectation. The walls of home protected her, yet they did not close her off from history. As she grew older, her education would have become more deliberate. Reading aloud, practicing penmanship, memorizing prayers, learning French phrases, playing music, and mastering graceful movement all helped prepare her for a refined world. Dance especially mattered at courtly levels of society. It taught balance, timing, posture, and the delicate conversation of the body, where every step seemed formal but also alive. Music would have drifted through such a household, a lute being tuned, a song being practiced, a psalm or hymn rising in devotion. These sounds softened the day and taught rhythm, memory, and restraint. Anne's brother George also received an education suited to future service and advancement. The siblings likely shared an atmosphere of learning that was more active than in many households, with language and conversation valued as signs of cultivation. That family atmosphere may help explain Anne's later confidence in sophisticated circles. She did not emerge from nowhere, and she did not simply arrive at court as a passive ornament. She had already been formed by a house that looked outward. The Boleyn ambition was quiet enough to remain respectable, but strong enough to shape the destinies of its children. There is something peaceful in imagining Anne before fame touched her name, before letters from kings, before disputes of marriage and religion, before judgment and memory. There was simply a girl moving through the familiar rooms of home. She would have known the weathered path across the grounds. She would have known which windows caught the morning sun, which corners stayed cold, and where to find silence when the house was busy. At times, visitors would arrive with news from beyond Kent. Fine horses at the gate, travel-stained cloaks, sealed letters, formal greetings, and the subtle quickening of servants could turn an ordinary day into one of importance. Children noticed these changes at once. Even if they were sent away from serious conversation, they could feel the difference in the air. Sometimes the household may have spoken of court. They would have spoken of the king's children, of foreign alliances, of noble marriages, and of the rich, glittering world that stood at the center of English life. For a young girl of rank, court was both promise and test. It was the place where one might shine, but also the place where one might be measured, used, and forgotten. That future was not yet visible in full. Still, the road toward it had already begun. Anne's family connections and her father's service made it likely from an early stage that she would not remain only in a country household. She was being prepared, gently and steadily, for a wider stage. The refinement expected of her was not accidental. It was an investment in future usefulness, and perhaps also a sign that her family believed she could carry herself well among the powerful. And yet childhood has its own calm logic. Even in ambitious families, there are quiet afternoons, idle glances from windows, fingers tracing embroidery, and long moments when history has not yet announced itself. One can picture Anne in such an hour. A page of a book open before her, a half-finished piece of needlework nearby, a candle burning low, and beyond the glass, a pale English sky. This softer view of Anne matters. Too often, later history pulls her backward through the shadow of her ending, as if she existed only to move toward tragedy. But no life feels that way when it is being lived. A child does not know what later generations will say. She knows the sound of her own name spoken by family. She knows whether the hearth is warm, whether the lesson is difficult, whether the chapel smells of wax and damp stone, and whether the day feels long or bright. So the first chapter of Anne Boleyn's life belongs to stillness more than drama. It belongs to formation, to household discipline, to family ambition, and to the rich texture of a Tudor childhood. Around her, England was becoming more confident under its new royal house. Yet beneath that confidence lay the old truth that everything rested on inheritance, marriage, favour, and the uncertain future. Anne grew up within that truth, even before she could name it. She was a daughter in a rising family, a child in a guarded kingdom, and a young mind being shaped for courts not yet seen. Soon, her world would widen beyond Hever. Ships, foreign languages, elegant courts, and new customs would carry her farther than most girls of her time could imagine. But for now, let the gates remain closed behind us. Let the castle rest in evening light, with its moat darkening, its windows glowing, and its household drawing inward as the day comes gently to its end. Servants cover the embers. Footsteps soften in the passage. Prayers are said. Doors are latched. And the quiet fields of Kent lie still beneath the gathering night. In one chamber, a young girl sleeps within the shelter of family and stone. She does not know that England will one day speak her name with fascination, sorrow, and wonder. For now, she belongs to childhood. She belongs to Hever, to candlelight, to learning, to silence, and to the long unfolding of a Tudor dawn that has only just begun. And in time, the world beyond Hever did begin to open, first as rumour, then as preparation, and then as movement. The child of the Kentish countryside was carried toward a wider Europe, where court shimmered with different customs, different languages, and different kinds of grace. For families who wished to rise, education did not end at home. It continued in noble households abroad, where a young girl could learn the Polish that books alone could never teach. At some point in her youth, Anne was sent across the Channel to the Low Countries. The journey itself must have felt like a threshold, with trunks packed carefully, garments folded, letters sealed, and farewells spoken in the muted tones of a family making plans for the future. Travel in the early 16th century was slow and uncomfortable. Roads were rough, weather uncertain, and the crossing of the water could be cold, damp, and uneasy even on a manageable day. Yet such travel was part of noble life. If influence, marriage, or service required movement, then movement was accepted with patience. The coast of England faded behind her. Ahead lay the territories ruled by Margaret of Austria, a woman of high birth, political skill, and cultivated taste. Margaret's court was a fitting place for a clever and ambitious family to send a daughter. It was known for order, learning, and refinement, and it offered something Anne could not have found in quite the same way in Kent. Here she entered a household shaped by Burgundian elegance. Its rhythms were courtly, but also disciplined, with formal service, careful instruction, and the strong awareness that the smallest behavior could reveal breeding and intelligence. The Low Countries were busy with trade, diplomacy, and movement. Merchants, envoys, clerics, and nobles passed through cities that felt more connected to the wider currents of Europe than many parts of England did. For a young girl, the change must have been vivid. Streets sounded different. Accents shifted in the ear. Fabrics gleamed in unfamiliar colours, and the very air of the place carried another pattern of life. Margaret of Austria herself had known both privilege and sorrow. She had been raised for politics, shaped by marriage negotiations, and seasoned by the hard lessons of dynastic life. Under her authority, a noble household became more than a residence. It became a school of conduct, a place where children of rank learn not only accomplishments, but composure. Anne would have heard French spoken constantly. She may already have known some of it, but immersion gave language a new texture, until words once practiced from lessons began to live in the mouth and ear. This mattered greatly. French was the language of diplomacy, fashion, and polished court conversation, and to possess it with ease was to carry a key into many rooms. There were lessons in reading and writing. There were prayers, music, embroidery, and the endless small refinements that taught a person how to move through company without awkwardness or haste. A court abroad also taught something subtler. It showed that power did not always wear the same face. In England, Anne had known one pattern of noble life. In the Low Countries, she saw another, where female authority could be more visible in the household, and where the arts of conversation, correspondence, and display were sharpened by international politics. Margaret's court valued books and learning. Manuscripts, devotional works, letters, and carefully copied texts moved through noble hands, carrying with them the quiet prestige of literacy and thought. For Anne, this must have been enlarging. The world became not just wider in distance, but richer in tone. Rooms were furnished with carved wood, hangings, cushions, desks, prayer books, and fine objects that spoke of rank without shouting it. Windows admitted northern light that could seem pale and silver, especially in the morning, when the day was just beginning and the household still held its breath. Life in such a court was ordered, but not still. Messages came and went, diplomatic concerns rose and settled, and the atmosphere was always aware of Europe beyond the chamber walls. A young attendant learned to sense these changes. She learned when to speak lightly, when to remain quiet, and when to understand that the adults around her were listening for news that might alter futures far away. If Hever had given Anne foundations, the Low Countries gave her finish. They offered not the full drama of queens and kings, but the steadier art of preparation. It is easy to imagine her here with growing confidence. Her accent changed, her eye became more trained, and her sense of style more alert to detail. She would have seen gowns cut in continental fashions. She would have noticed sleeves, hoods, veils, jewels, and the careful arrangement of cloth, all of it teaching that beauty in courtly life was often a matter of line, proportion, and restraint. Meals, too, held their lessons. The ordering of dishes, the placing of guests, the pace of service, and the language of courtesy all formed part of a larger education in rank. There was also devotion. Chapels remained central, and religion continued to mark the hours of noble life with an authority that no courtly elegance displaced. Candles burned before altars. Voices rose in prayer, and Latin still wound through the day like a familiar thread. But Anne's time in Margaret's household was only the beginning of her continental education. Soon, a larger and more glittering world would draw her onward. In 1514, Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor was sent to France to marry the aging King Louis XII. A noble train accompanied her, and Anne Boleyn seems to have been among those connected with the English princess's journey. So once again, there were trunks, roads, and formal departures. Once again, a young girl crossed from one world into another. Only now the destination was the French royal court, brighter and more dazzling than anything she had yet known. France offered another kind of refinement. If the Burgundian world had taught structure and cultivated poise, the French court added fluency, style, and the living brilliance that made a deep impression on many who entered it. There was movement everywhere. Silk brushed across polished floors, conversation drifted through galleries, music rose from chambers, and the air seemed charged with taste, ceremony, and wit. Mary Tudor's queenship in France was brief. Louis XII died only months after the marriage, and the English princess soon returned home. But Anne did not return with her. Instead, she remained in France, where she entered the household of Queen Claude, the wife of the new king, Francis I. This decision would shape the rest of her life. France became the place where her manners ripened and where her adult identity began to take clearer form. Queen Claude's household was pious, royal, and full of expectation. Around it moved the larger, more dazzling orbit of Francis I's court, known for pageantry, conversation, fashion, and restless ambition. The French king himself was young, energetic, and eager to present his monarchy as magnificent. Tournaments, hunting, banquets, fabrics, jewels, and diplomacy all formed part of the atmosphere Anne now breathed. Yet to imagine the French court only as glitter would miss its deeper texture. It was also a place of routine, rank, prayer, fatigue, and constant observation. A lady in waiting lived close to privilege, but not in ease. She attended, waited, dressed, followed, listened, and learned. She learned the tempo of royal days. She learned how a queen rose, prayed, received visitors, moved from chamber to chapel, took meals, and was surrounded at nearly every moment by hierarchy made visible. Anne would have watched Queen Claude with close attention. Claude was known for her piety and gentleness, and her household reflected a more sober tone than the brilliant reputation of Francis's wider court might suggest. This contrast itself was instructive. A court was never just one thing. It contained devotion and flirtation, simplicity and display, prayer and politics, all moving side by side beneath painted ceilings and candle smoke. For a perceptive young woman, such a place was a living lesson in complexity. French fashion left a lasting mark on Anne. The lines of the gowns, the drape of fabrics, the jeweled headpieces, and the more fluid elegance of continental dress offered a style she would later carry back to England. She learned, too, the French art of presentation. Not loudness, but sparkle. not merely ornament, but the ability to seem alert, graceful, and entirely present in the moment. Language deepened around her. French was no longer the language of instruction alone, but of everyday speech, refined exchange, courtly compliment, and intellectual life. That fluency would later distinguish her in England. It gave her a cosmopolitan air, and perhaps also a confidence that came from having lived beyond the island world of her birth. France in these years stood at the center of Renaissance influence. Humanist ideas, artistic patronage, elegant manuscript culture, and lively court conversation were all part of the atmosphere in which Anne matured. She may not have been a scholar in the strict sense, but she seems to have absorbed the tone of a court where intelligence could sharpen charm. Books, prayer, letters, and polished speech were not separate ornaments, but connected forms of cultivation. Music drifted through these chambers as it had in earlier households, though here perhaps with greater variety and richness. Dances were more intricate, conversation more fluid, and the balance between ceremony and delight more carefully managed. A young woman who listened well could learn by imitation how to incline the head, how to answer lightly, how to move in a dance, how to speak with wit but not excess. All of this belonged to the education of presence. The French court also trained the eye. Anne would have seen illuminated books, fine plate, tapestries crowded with color, carved furniture, and rooms arranged to impress not only with wealth, but with harmony. Outside, there were gardens, hunting grounds, river views, and palace courtyards where weather changed the mood of everything. Autumn mist, winter fires, and spring light all altered the same architecture into new scenes. She likely travelled with the royal household from place to place, because courts in this period were often moving worlds. Palaces filled, emptied, and filled again, while servants, attendants, horses, carts, and chests turned royal life into a long procession through the kingdom. That movement prevented stillness from growing dull. Each arrival brought new rooms, new arrangements, new local sounds, and new chances to observe. Yet it also meant that nothing was entirely settled. A courtier learned to carry her order with her. Garments had to be kept ready. Letters had to be answered. Devotions maintained, and a composed face shown even when journeys were tiring and chambers unfamiliar. In France, Anne was also close to the wider world of diplomacy. Marriages, alliances, papal politics, rivalries with other rulers, and the ever-shifting balance of Europe formed the background hum of royal life. She would not have directed these matters, of course, but she lived near enough to power to hear its murmur and understand that kingdoms were woven together by promises as delicate as lace and as fragile as glass. This was also a period when religion, though still publicly united in Western Christendom, had begun to stir with new questions. Reforming voices were not yet remaking England, but the circulation of ideas, texts, and criticism was already part of Europe's atmosphere. At court, such matters did not always appear as open dispute. Often, they lived in the choice of books, the favor shown to certain scholars, the tone of private devotion, and the quiet interest of educated people in new currents of thought. Anne's later sympathy for reforming religious ideas may have found some early nourishment here. France exposed her to a world where piety and intellectual curiosity could exist together, even if carefully. Still, it would be wrong to make her youth abroad feel heavy with future significance at every turn. Many of these years were likely filled with ordinary courtly tasks, waiting, observing, sewing, praying, and adapting to the demands of rank. The great changes of history do not announce themselves each morning. Often, they move beneath days that feel repetitive and almost calm. Anne's gifts, whatever exact shape they had at this age, seemed to have been ripening. She was not said to be the most conventionally beautiful woman of her time, but she was often remembered as striking, graceful, dark-eyed, and alive with energy. That last quality matters. Some people possess a still beauty, while others create an impression through movement, expression, and intelligence. France may have helped Anne become the second kind. It gave her a stage on which charm could be sharpened into something memorable. She would have seen ladies whose style was light and confident. She would have seen how attention could be held not only by jewels, but by wit, by timing, and by the sense that a person was inwardly awake. And so, the girl from Hever was changing, not all at once, and not into someone entirely new, but into a fuller version of herself. The French years gave her smoothness without emptiness. They gave her sophistication, but also habit, discipline, and the subtle endurance required in a court where one was always among others. Even leisure in such a place had rules. Walks, songs, reading, needlework, dancing, and conversation were all shaped by watchfulness. To be too eager was unwise. To be too withdrawn could make one invisible. So Anne learned that delicate middle ground. She learned to be noticed without seeming to ask for notice. Perhaps there were evenings when she stood near a window as daylight faded over a French palace roof. The bells rang for prayer, servants moved in the corridors, and the smoke of many hearths rose into a cooling sky. In such moments, England may have felt distant and soft in memory. Hever's moat, Kent's damp fields, and the measured quiet of childhood would have remained somewhere behind her, like a song only half heard. Yet she was not lost abroad. She was being formed. The Boleyn family had sent her outward, and outward she had gone, gathering language, posture, confidence, and a continental sensibility that would one day make her unusual at the English court. She was no longer only the daughter of a rising family in Kent. She had become a young woman with European polish. She had seen more than many around her age would ever see, and the experience had entered her manner so deeply that it would not easily leave. Years passed in this way, not in one burst of transformation, but through repeated days, repeated ceremonies, repeated acts of attention. Then, at last, England called her home. Around 1521 or 1522, Anne returned from France to the country of her birth. The crossing back must have carried a different feeling from the crossing out. She left not as a child beginning her training, but as a cultivated young woman returning with new habits, new tastes, and a presence shaped by foreign courts. England itself had changed while she was away. Henry VIII was now firmly on the throne. young still, admired, athletic, musical, and surrounded by a court more brilliant than the careful, restrained world of his father. The heir of England was waiting for her, though she did not yet know how deeply her life would become entangled with it. She returned, carrying France in her voice, in her eye, in her style, and perhaps in her inward sense of possibility. The old rhythms of home may have felt smaller now, familiar, dear, and yet no longer enough to contain all that she had become. Soon she would enter the English court, where queens, cardinals, ladies, ambassadors and noblemen moved through chapels and chambers under the gaze of one powerful king. Soon the art she'd learned abroad would find their stage in her own country. But for now, let her journey end quietly. Let the ship approach the English shore beneath a pale sky, while gulls circle above and the wind presses cool against wood and sail. A young woman stands among trunks, attendants, and folded cloaks. Behind her lie the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude, and before her rises the island kingdom, where memory will keep her name alive for centuries. And so she came back to England, carrying with her the quiet polish of foreign courts and the memory of French voices in long galleries. The shore that received her was familiar, yet it belonged now to a different stage of life. The kingdom she re-entered was more radiant than the one she had left as a child. Henry VIII ruled in the full brightness of youth, and his court had become one of the most splendid in Europe. His father, Henry VII, had built security with caution and thrift. His son preferred music, tournaments, hunting, rich cloth, and the visible majesty of kingship. Yet beneath the glitter, the same Tudor anxieties remained. A dynasty still needed heirs, noble families still needed favour, and the court remained a place where smiles could conceal hard calculations. London drew all of this toward itself. The city was busy, smoky, crowded, and alive with trade, bells, horses, and the endless movement of people who served the crown or sought to come near it. The royal palaces stood apart from the ordinary press of streets, but they were never truly removed from it. Westminster, Greenwich, Richmond, and other great residences filled and emptied with the tide of royal life. For Anne, the return to England was not a retreat into quiet country days. It was an entrance into the most watched and ritualized world in the kingdom. She soon found her place in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon. To serve the Queen was a mark of honor, and it placed Anne near the heart of English ceremonial life. Catherine was by then a figure of deep dignity. She had been a Spanish princess, the widow of Prince Arthur, and then the wife of Henry VIII, and she carried herself with piety, discipline, and royal steadiness. Many admired her sincerely. She was learned, devout, charitable, and committed to the duties of queenship with a seriousness that touched both court and kingdom. Her household reflected those qualities. It was orderly, observant of religion, and shaped by the old expectations of rank, service, and female virtue. As one of Catherine's ladies, Anne entered a world of tapestries, chapel processions, formal meals, and carefully arranged attendance. A queen was rarely alone, and those around her learned to move with quiet precision through every hour of the day. Mornings began early. Prayers, dressing, audiences, messages, and meals followed one another in a pattern that could appear serene from a distance, even though many lives were required to sustain it. The royal wardrobe itself formed a kind of language. Velvet, satin, cloth of gold, fur lining, jeweled girdles, and French or English hoods all spoke of place, favour, and occasion. Anne, with her continental experience, knew how much clothing could say before a person spoke. She also knew how style could be used not merely to adorn, but to signal refinement and self-command. At Henry's court, appearance mattered greatly, yet so did conversation, dance, music, family alliances, and the subtle question of who stood near whom when the king entered a room. The king himself was still admired as a prince of rare gifts. He rode well, hunted with energy, wrote music, enjoyed debate, and liked to present himself as both chivalric and magnificent. In public, he could seem warm and brilliant. He loved display, but he also understood the theatre of kingship, and he knew how a splendid court enlarged the image of his power. Around him moved noble families eager for advancement. They watched royal favour as carefully as farmers watch the sky. Some families rose through loyal service. Others hoped to secure marriages, offices, pensions, lands, or influence through patient attendance and the right alliances at the right moment. No figure embodied the machinery of this courtly world more fully than Cardinal Wolsey. He was not of ancient noble blood, yet he had risen through intelligence, labour, and the king's confidence until he stood at the summit of power beneath the crown. Wolsey's presence could be felt everywhere. He directed policy, managed diplomacy, oversaw legal and ecclesiastical business, and conducted himself with a magnificence that sometimes seemed almost princely. To young people entering court, he represented both promise and warning. A man could rise astonishingly high in Tudor England, but only by remaining useful, and usefulness always depended on the king's pleasure. Anne learned quickly, if she did not know it already, that court life was made of watching. One watched the king, the queen, the cardinal, the leading nobles, foreign ambassadors, and even the faces of servants who often sensed news before it was spoken aloud. Ceremonies softened many of these tensions. Processions, feast days, chapel services, masques, and entertainments wrapped ambition in elegance. On festival nights, candlelight multiplied on polished surfaces. Music sounded through halls, fabric shimmered, and faces appeared and vanished behind movement, laughter, and the formal ease of noble performance. Anne was well suited to this world. Her years abroad had given her fluency in the very things that English courtiers valued and remembered. She spoke French with ease. She danced well, dressed with skill, and seems to have possessed that quickness of presence that made others glance twice. Some who later described her did not dwell on perfect features. Instead, they remembered expression, dark eyes, animation, and the distinctive impression she created in company. This kind of charm could be especially powerful at court. It worked not by still perfection, but by movement, timing, intelligence, and the sense that the person before you was vividly awake. There were entertainments in which young ladies appeared in rich costume before the king and court. One such spectacle the pageant known as the Chateau Vert, took place not long after Anne's return, and she seems to have taken part in it. In such performances, allegory and elegance moved together. Ladies embodied virtues, courtiers played symbolic roles, and pleasure itself became a language of status and refinement. These occasions mattered more than they might seem. They allowed young people to be seen, remembered, and quietly assessed within the safety of ritual. Anne's place in the Queen's household also brought her near other women whose fates were tied to marriage, fertility, and noble strategy. Their days might seem graceful from the outside, but they lived under the unspoken pressure of expectation. Every noble daughter understood this in some form. A good marriage could raise a family, strengthen alliances, and shape generations yet unborn. At some point, Anne became connected with discussions of a possible marriage to James Butler, an Irish nobleman whose union with her might have settled inheritance questions between families. The match did not come to pass, but its very consideration reminds us that she was already regarded as valuable. She was not drifting through court without definition. She was a young woman of good birth, growing distinction and real usefulness in the careful arithmetic of family ambition. There was also another story, quieter and more personal, which later observers connected with these years. Anne appears to have formed an attachment with Henry Percy, the heir to the Earl of Northumberland. Whether the understanding between them was formal or only hopeful, it stirred concern. A match of that kind touched questions of rank, family permission, and perhaps other interests not fully visible to those around them. The matter did not end gently. Wolsey intervened, and the connection was broken. In the stillness of historical distance, one can imagine the sorrow of such a moment without needing to enlarge it into drama. At court, private feeling often had to bow before calculation. A young woman might learn through one such disappointment how little of her own future truly belonged to her. Rank gave privilege, but it also narrowed the path. Anne remained at court nonetheless. She continued to move through the Queen's world of prayers, audiences, and noble attendance, carrying herself in the composed way that court life demanded. The Queen's household was not isolated from the King's pleasures. Hunting parties, banquets, tournaments, and celebrations drew together the larger world of the court, and all who belonged to it learned the rhythm of royal movement. A Tudor progress or court season could feel like a tide washing from palace to palace. Chests were packed, horses readied, chambers assigned, and the familiar labour of royal life began again in a new setting. At Greenwich, the river air moved softly around the palace walls. At Westminster, politics pressed more close. At Hampton Court, whose magnificence Wolsey had shaped, guests entered a world of carved ceilings, rich hangings, and carefully displayed grandeur. Anne saw all of this not as a visitor, but as a participant. She lived inside the procession of Tudor life, where sacred observance and worldly splendour unfolded side by side. The Queen heard Mass, the King hunted, ambassadors waited for audience, ladies embroidered, read, exchanged glances, or moved through the long duties of attendance. And always there were letters. Letters from abroad, from noble households, from bishops, from envoys, and from those who hoped that the written word might secure what open requests could not. The English court was connected to all of Europe through such messages. News from France, Spain, the Empire and Rome entered chamber after chamber, changing the mood of a day before most people understood why. Anne's education abroad helped her move confidently in this atmosphere. She had seen European courts already, and so she could recognize both the brilliance and the vanity of what surrounded her. In another woman, foreign polish might have seemed distant or overly sharp. In Anne, it appears to have mingled with English restraint in a way that made her memorable. Meanwhile, Queen Catherine continued to command respect, but one silent sorrow had begun to settle over the marriage at the center of the kingdom. She had borne children, yet only Princess Mary survived. This fact mattered far beyond the royal nursery. An heir was not merely a child for the king and queen, but a pillar for the dynasty, and each failed hope deepened unease. At first, the unease remained muted. The king and queen still appeared together in ceremony, and the outward form of royal life retained its grace. Yet everyone understood what was missing. No healthy son stood ready to continue the Tudor line. That absence did not at once unmake the court, but it entered conversations, calculations, and private thoughts like a draft entering beneath a closed door. Anne moved through this atmosphere while still only one lady among many. She was visible, perhaps increasingly so, but not yet the central figure she would become. Her sister Mary Boleyn had already drawn royal notice and became associated with the king in a way that later generations would remember. The exact shape and timing of that connection remain partly veiled, but it brought the Boleyn family nearer to the bright, dangerous center of favor. This too would have been instructive. Anne could observe from close range how royal attention elevated and exposed those who received it. At court, nothing remained entirely private. A glance could be discussed, a dance remembered, a gift interpreted, and a silence filled with rumor before the sun went down. The Boleyn family understood this world well. Thomas Boleyn continued to rise through service, and the family's position improved as their usefulness to the crown became more apparent. Their ambition was no secret, though it was expressed with the smoothness of experienced courtiers. They knew that advancement depended on seeming both capable and deserving. Anne's own character seems to have resisted simple placement. She could be gracious, but not meek, accomplished, but not blank, and pious, while also alert to the pleasures and intelligence of cultivated life. Such qualities drew admiration and irritation in equal measure. A woman who shone too brightly in courtly company could easily be judged by those who preferred gentler outlines. Still, she remained within the Queen's service. That fact is important because it meant that Anne's rise began in the household of the woman whose place she would one day threaten. There is a quiet sadness in that arrangement. The same corridors, chapels, and ceremonial spaces held both women long before open conflict touched them. One may imagine a winter evening at court. Fires burn low in great chambers, the smell of rushes and wax lingers, and ladies sit with embroidery while conversation moves softly around them. Perhaps a musician plays nearby. Perhaps a chaplain has recently finished prayers, and for a moment all the noise of politics seems far away. It was in such a world, not in sudden thunder, that Anne's story advanced. The changes that altered kingdoms often began with ordinary days. Henry VIII's first clear interest in Anne is usually placed in the middle years of the 1520s. It did not begin as an open political campaign, but as attention directed toward one particular woman within a crowded court. What first drew him is impossible to know with certainty. Perhaps it was her wit, her difference from others, her French grace, or the fact that she did not yield herself easily to the familiar pattern of courtly pursuit. That resistance mattered. In a court where the king had long been admired and obeyed, refusal could seem more alluring than ready consent. Anne appears to have understood the danger of becoming merely another royal diversion. Whether by instinct, conviction, ambition, or all three together, she seems to have held back from that role. Her caution changed the tone of the king's pursuit. What might have remained a passing attraction slowly acquired gravity. The court, so skilled at reading signs, could not fail to notice. A look held too long, an increase in conversation, a gift, a growing frequency of Anne's presence, all such things were observed. Whispers would have travelled along galleries and behind hangings. Servants, ladies, gentlemen, and ambassadors all listened to the shifting weather around the throne. Yet nothing was settled at once. The king was still married, the queen still honoured, and Anne still only one woman in a court built on appearances of order. That order, however, had begun to tremble very softly. The tremor was not yet enough to shake the walls, but it was enough to alter the air. Anne's own place became more delicate with each passing season. To attract royal favour brought opportunity, but it also invited jealousy, scrutiny, and the risk of becoming the object through which other people pursued their own hopes or fears. Her family's fortunes were now tied more closely to hers. Advancement might come through the king's regard, but so might resentment from those who saw the Boleyns rising too quickly. Cardinal Wolsey, always alert to changes that might affect the balance of power, watched the court carefully. He had his own priorities, his own sense of order, and his own understanding of what should or should not be permitted to grow. Queen Catherine, for her part, remained a figure of composure. It is possible that in these early moments, no final breach had yet appeared, only hints that something in the old harmony was beginning to loosen. And through it all, the daily round continued. Masses were sung, meals served, letters opened, horses saddled, sleeves fastened, petitions delivered, and the king's household moved through splendour as if splendour itself could preserve stability. That is one of the most haunting qualities of court life. The rituals go on even as the ground beneath them begins to shift. Anne would have felt this in ways both visible and invisible. She had come to court as a cultivated young woman seeking a place, and now the king's growing attention was turning her into something more dangerous than a lady in waiting. Still, there were no final answers yet. There was only an increasing intensity wrapped in decorum. The chapel still glowed with candlelight. The Queen still processed in dignity. The King still hunted, feasted, and received noble visitors beneath rich canopies and painted beams. But those who lived close to power could sense when private feeling began to press against public form. In the case of Henry and Anne, that pressure would not remain private for long. Soon letters would matter more than glances. Soon questions of marriage, conscience, succession, and authority would gather around one woman who had once seemed only a graceful figure among many at court. For now, though, let the scene remain suspended. Let Anne move through the palace in measured steps, her French hood set carefully, her hands folded, her mind alert, while voices murmur in distant chambers and the evening bells begin to sound. She does not yet wear a crown. She does not yet stand at the center of England's most dangerous question. But the King has begun to look toward her with more than passing favor. And in the long, candlelit halls of Tudor England, that alone is enough to change the fate of many lives. And so the quiet tension of court could no longer remain only a matter of glances and whispers. What had begun as royal favor slowly unfolded into years of waiting, debate, and strain, until the private wish of a king became the great question of the realm. Henry VIII did not seek Anne as he had sought passing diversions in earlier years. He wanted something more enduring, and he wanted it in a form the law, the church, and the kingdom would accept. That made everything slower. Desire moved quickly, but kingship did not. Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, and that marriage had stood for many years at the center of English ceremonial life. Yet the absence of a surviving son had become, in the king's mind, more than sorrow. It had become a judgment. He seems to have persuaded himself that his union with Catherine had never been fully lawful in the sight of God. The argument rested on old and difficult ground. Catherine had first been married to Henry's elder brother, Prince Arthur, and after Arthur's death, she later married Henry under a papal dispensation. For years, that settlement had been accepted. But now Henry turned back toward the biblical words that troubled him, especially passages that seemed to warn a man against taking his brother's wife. Whether this fear came first from conscience, dynastic anxiety, desire for Anne, or some mingling of all three is still debated. Human motives are rarely tidy, and royal motives even less so. What mattered in practice was that Henry had begun to seek release from his marriage. He wanted the union with Catherine declared invalid so that he might marry again and secure the future of the Tudor line. Catherine did not accept this. She maintained, with dignity and firmness, that her first marriage to Arthur had not been consummated, and that her marriage to Henry was therefore lawful. Her position was not only personal, it was sacramental, legal, and dynastic, and she defended it with a calm endurance that many admired. Anne stood near the center of this gathering storm, though not yet as queen, and not yet even as an openly secure future bride. The years that followed would place her in a strange position, courted by the king, watched by the court, and measured by all of Europe. Henry wrote to her. Some of his letters survive, and in them one hears not only affection, but impatience, longing, and the sense of a man who believed his will should in time reshape the world around him. Anne did not give herself lightly. That decision, whether rooted in caution, ambition, moral conviction, or careful judgment, changed the whole course of events. Had she agreed to become only the king's mistress, the matter might have faded into a familiar pattern. Instead, the possibility of marriage remained before Henry, and because it remained, the kingdom was drawn into the question with him. The court watched every step. One season followed another, and still Anne did not become either queen or discarded favourite. She remained in a suspended place. That uncertainty made her more powerful and more vulnerable at the same time. Cardinal Wolsey was first entrusted with solving the problem. He was still the king's chief minister, still magnificent, still deeply practiced in the art of turning royal desire into practical form. Yet this was no ordinary diplomatic business. The marriage to Catherine was tied to Spain, to papal authority, and to the fragile balance of Europe. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Christendom. The Pope could not consider Henry's request in a vacuum, because politics surrounded theology on every side. In Rome, there was caution. In England, there was impatience. Wolsey tried to move the matter through legal and ecclesiastical channels. Papers were examined, arguments prepared, and learned men searched scripture, canon law, and precedent for a path through the difficulty. All this took time. Time in such matters did not pass quietly. Ambassadors carried news across roads and seas. Clerks copied documents by candlelight. Bishops weighed their words, and courtiers adjusted their hopes according to each rumour that came from abroad. Anne's own life during these years was filled with waiting, but not passive waiting. She remained near the king, received his devotion, and saw her family rise as royal favour gathered around her. Thomas Boleyn gained honours and offices. Her brother George moved closer to influence, and the Boleyn name came more often into the speech of those who watched the court. This rise pleased some and disturbed others. There were families who resented the speed of Boleyn advancement, and those who preferred the older order centred on Queen Catherine. So the struggle deepened on several levels at once. It was a matter of conscience for Henry, legitimacy for Catherine, ambition for some, survival for others, and keen uncertainty for nearly everyone close to power. In 1529, the long-awaited Legatine Court finally assembled at Blackfriars in London. There, Henry's case would be heard by Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio, the papal representative sent from Rome. The setting was solemn. Lawyers, clergy, nobles, and attendants filled the space, while the kingdom waited to see whether the marriage at the centre of Tudor life would be undone. It was here that Catherine made her famous appeal directly to Henry. She knelt before him and spoke with controlled emotion, reminding him of their years together and insisting upon the justice of her cause. The moment lingered in memory because it joined dignity to vulnerability. It also showed that this was no cold legal abstraction, but the breaking open of a royal household before the eyes of many. Yet the court at Blackfriars did not give Henry what he wanted. Catherine appealed to Rome, and the process stalled. For Wolsey, failure in the king's great matter was dangerous, In Tudor England, a minister could survive much, but not prolonged inability to satisfy the monarch on the question he cared for most. Wolsey fell from favour. His great houses, his splendid authority, and the immense machinery of influence he had built could not protect him once the king turned away. There was sadness in his fall, even for those who had resented him. A man who had climbed so high now discovered how swiftly Tudor service could become Tudor ruin. He was charged, stripped of office, and withdrew from the centre of power. Before he could fully answer the charges against him, he died in 1530, leaving behind the memory of astonishing rise and abrupt decline. Anne could not have failed to notice the lesson. If Wolsey, once so mighty, could be brought low by the king's displeasure, then no favour in England could be called secure. After Wolsey's fall, the path ahead did not become clearer at once. It became, in some ways, more searching. Henry began to rely on a wider circle of advisers. Among them, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell would in time prove especially important. Cranmer was a scholar and churchman, thoughtful and careful in manner. He proposed that the king's case might be studied not only in Rome, but by learned universities and theologians across Europe. This idea appealed to Henry. If scholars could be gathered to support his argument, then conscience and learning might seem to stand together. So opinions were sought from universities in England, France, and Italy. Learned men weighed scriptural passages, papal powers, and the limits of ecclesiastical authority. Their answers did not all agree, but the very process widened the matter. What had once seemed a king's marital difficulty became a European debate over law, scripture, and power. Cromwell, by contrast, was not a scholar in the same way. He was practical, sharp, and remarkably able to see how institutions could be redirected when old channels failed. Under his influence, attention turned more seriously toward Parliament and the laws of England. If Rome would not easily give judgment, perhaps the kingdom might begin to define more firmly where authority rested within its own borders. These changes were not sudden in feeling. They came through sessions, statutes, arguments, and careful pressure. Yet beneath their legal form, they altered the atmosphere of the whole realm. Clergy, abbots, bishops, lawyers, and noble households all sensed that something larger than one marriage was beginning to shift. Anne herself seems to have encouraged some of the new thinking. She had interest in religious reform, valued certain devotional texts, and moved within circles where criticism of church abuses could be voiced with care. This did not make her a simple revolutionary figure. The world she inhabited was still deeply Christian, sacramental, and shaped by old forms of devotion. But she appears to have been receptive to learned reforming currents. She read, listened, and perhaps helped bring some of these ideas closer to the king. One story, often repeated, tells of Anne drawing Henry's attention to works that argued kings held God-given authority within their own realms. Whether every detail is certain or not, it fits the wider truth that her household became associated with reform-minded clergy and texts. These years therefore belong not only to courtship, but to books. Quiet pages, carried hand to hand, could sometimes matter as much as embassies. In monastic houses, the old hours of prayer still continued. Bells rang across cloisters, candles burned before altars, and communities of monks and nuns kept their familiar routines. Yet even there, unease slowly entered. Reports were gathered, loyalties weighed, and many churchmen wondered how far the king meant to press his claim. Bishops found themselves in uneasy positions. They were servants of the church, but also subjects of the crown. To oppose the king openly was perilous. To comply too readily could trouble conscience and reputation. Ordinary people felt these changes more dimly, but not at all. Sermons, rumours, and the moods of local clergy carried fragments of the great matter into towns, villages, and market streets. Still, much of life went on as it always had. Fields were worked, children baptized, bread baked, prayers said, and household fires tended against the weather. That contrast gave the Tudor years their strange texture. While the king sought freedom to marry again, the kingdom around him continued in daily habit, scarcely aware how much would soon be altered by the legal steps taken in distant halls. Anne lived meanwhile in a position both elevated and incomplete. She was no longer merely one lady among many, but neither was she yet crowned or secure. Henry's devotion to her became more visible. He gave her gifts, honours, and increasingly treated her as a woman who would one day stand beside him. Not everyone welcomed this. To supporters of Catherine, Anne seemed an interloper. To foreign observers, she was often described through the language of threat or fascination. To her own family and allies, she represented the possible future. The king's household began to bend around that possibility. Servants, chaplains, and petitioners learned to consider how near Anne stood to favour, and what favour near Anne might bring. In 1532, an important public sign of her rising place appeared. Henry created Anne Marquess of Pembroke in her own right, a remarkable honour for a woman not yet queen. The ceremony gave visible form to what had long been understood. She was no passing affection. That same year, Anne accompanied Henry to Calais for meetings with Francis I of France. The journey had diplomatic purpose, but it also displayed Anne before foreign eyes as the woman the English king intended to advance. Calais must have carried echoes for her. It stood between England and France, between the island kingdom of her birth and the continental world that had once formed her manners. There, amid receptions, fabrics, processions, and negotiations, Anne moved not as an obscure attendant, but as a figure of consequence. The French king's recognition did not settle her future, but it lent it a certain brightness. Still, the deepest question remained unresolved. Henry needed a lawful path to marriage. By now, Parliament had begun to play a more forceful role in reshaping the relationship between Crown and Church in England. Measures were directed against clerical privilege, against certain payments to Rome, and against appeals that carried English cases beyond the kingdom. Each statute seemed technical on the surface. Together, they formed a slow withdrawal of English obedience from papal jurisdiction. This was a grave change, though it often moved in the language of procedure rather than open rebellion. The old unity of Western Christendom did not break in one loud hour. It loosened through clauses, signatures, seals, and repeated acts of pressure. In royal chambers, these things were discussed in terms of law, authority, and necessity. In monasteries and parish churches, they were felt more as uncertainty. Men who had long prayed for the Pope in the old accustomed way now wondered what words the future would require. The king's conscience still stood at the center of his own argument. He believed, or said he believed, that England could not prosper while he remained in an unlawful union. Anne's body now also mattered in a very practical way. Time passed, and with it the urgency of succession. If Henry was to have the son he longed for, he could not wait forever. Dynasties, like candles, seemed steady until one noticed how much wax had already gone. At the opening of 1533, events moved more quickly. Anne was pregnant, or believed to be, and the need for legal resolution became immediate. Sometime in January, Henry and Anne married in secret. The ceremony was quiet because the public legal situation had not yet fully caught up with the private act. What must Anne have felt then? Relief, triumph, trembling, hope, and perhaps also the knowledge that secrecy, even for a little while, revealed how uncertain the ground still was. Soon, Thomas Cranmer, now elevated to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, became central to the final settlement. He opened proceedings that examined the validity of Henry's marriage to Catherine, and then the lawfulness of the king's union with Anne. In May 1533, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null. Shortly after, he recognized the marriage to Anne as valid. These judgments changed more than names. They reordered the shape of the English court and placed Anne on the legal threshold of queenship. Catherine was no longer to be addressed as queen, but as Princess Dowager of Wales, a title tied to her first husband, Prince Arthur. She did not accept the justice of this change, but the machinery of the realm now moved against her position. Princess Mary, too, was pushed into a painful uncertainty. Questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and status now touched mother and daughter alike. Such changes were not gentle. Even when spoken in legal language, they carried the weight of sorrow through households, chapels, and private chambers. Anne, however, had reached the height toward which all the long years had strained. In June 1533, she was crowned Queen of England. London prepared for the spectacle with all the pageantry the Tudor court could summon. Barges moved along the river, rich cloth hung from windows, and the city became a stage of colour, emblem, and expectation. The coronation procession wound through streets lined with citizens, officials, and observers from many ranks of life. Anne was displayed in magnificence, clothed and carried as the future mother of the hoped-for heir. Ceremony gave her what waiting had delayed. Trumpets, canopies, jewels, and sacred ritual placed her where no court whisper could now deny she stood. At Westminster Abbey, the old forms of anointing and crowning gathered around her. Whatever controversies had made her ascent possible, the rite itself wrapped her in the ancient language of queenship. For a brief moment, all seemed to shine. The long pursuit had ended in marriage, the legal obstacles had been broken, and the woman once watched from the edges of the court now sat beside the king as crowned consort. Yet even in that brightness, uncertainty remained. A crown could settle one question while opening many others. Catherine still lived. Mary still existed as the king's daughter, though now displaced. Europe had not agreed with Henry's course, and many in England accepted the new order more from obedience than from conviction. Under the gold cloth and candlelight, tension remained folded into the seams of triumph. Anne herself was expecting a child, and so all hope gathered toward the cradle not yet prepared. If she bore a son, the years of dispute might seem justified in the eyes of many. If she did not, then the hard-won splendor around her might prove more fragile than it appeared. Tudor magnificence could glow warmly in public, while beneath it the future still trembled. So let the coronation candles burn softly for a moment longer. Let the bells ring over London, the river carry away the sounds of celebration, and the new queen pass beneath embroidered canopies into chambers fragrant with wax, flowers, and summer air. She has reached the crown at last, yet the peace she has gained is delicate, and the kingdom that raised her toward it has already begun to change in ways none of its people can fully measure. In the weeks after the coronation, the new queen lived within a brightness that was both real and fragile. Summer lay warm over the river, and the palaces of the king seemed to wait with her for the child who was expected to secure everything. Rooms were prepared with great care. Linen was folded, cradles arranged, hangings chosen, and officers of the household moved with the solemn busyness that attends a royal birth. Anne now lived at the center of ceremony. Her chambers were fuller than they had ever been, and her days were shaped by ladies, chaplains, physicians, messengers, and those who served the many practical needs of queenship. To be queen was not only to wear rich fabric and receive reverence. It was to inhabit a public role from morning until night, where prayer, audience, meal, and even rest unfolded beneath the eyes of others. She had waited a long time to arrive at this place, yet arrival did not bring quiet. Henry's hopes rested upon her body now more heavily than before. The long contest with Catherine of Aragon, the break with old habits of obedience, and the great public labor of making Anne queen all lean toward one expectation. That expectation had a cradle at its center. England wanted, or had been told to want, a son. In September of 1533, the waiting ended. Anne gave birth at Greenwich Palace to a daughter, the child who would be named Elizabeth. The bells rang. Guns were fired. Proclamations were made. And all the outward signs of rejoicing appeared as they should. Yet beneath the ceremonies, a quieter disappointment moved through the court. A healthy princess was a blessing, but she was not the prince for whom so much had been risked. Anne would have felt both truths at once. She had brought a living child safely into the world, and that child was the king's lawful heir under the new order. Yet the air around the cradle was not entirely at rest. Still, the baby was cherished in the formal language of celebration. Goldsmiths, cloth merchants, chaplains, wet nurses, and attendants all played their part in the orderly splendor that surrounded a Tudor infant of the highest rank. The nursery had its own rhythms. There were prayers, feeding, swaddling, changes of linen, careful records, and the many routines by which noble children were tended. A royal child was never only a child. She was a future, a symbol, and an answer offered to a kingdom that had been taught to measure security by bloodline. Elizabeth was declared legitimate. Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter, was pushed aside by law and ceremony alike. This change carried sorrow into more than one household. Mary was still the king's child, still the daughter of a woman many people continued to honor, and her displacement left a wound that would not heal quickly. Anne's own relationship with Mary would become one of the bitter threads in her queenship. The girl resisted the new order, resisted the loss of her mother's title, and refused the easy surrender that the court might have preferred. Such resistance made every domestic arrangement feel political. A place at table, a form of address, an oath, or the order of a procession could all carry the weight of dynastic struggle. Meanwhile, Queen Catherine lived apart, diminished in title but not in inner certainty. She continued to regard herself as Henry's true wife, and many in England quietly agreed with her. So Anne's crown did not rest upon a clear field. It rested beside another woman's claim, another daughter's grief, and a kingdom not fully persuaded that law had settled what conscience still debated. Yet daily life required movement forward. Anne established her household as queen, and in doing so, she created a courtly world around herself. Officers were appointed, ladies served in attendance, musicians played, chaplains read prayers, and gifts passed in and out of her chambers in the ancient rhythm of royal favor. Clothing remained one of the visible languages of her place. Rich velvets, satin sleeves, jeweled borders, and the dark elegance of the French hood all helped mark her distinct presence within the English court. She seems to have favored style that was polished rather than heavy. Her appearance had long been part of her impression upon others, and as queen, she used visual grace with confidence. There were public meals where rank was displayed with quiet firmness. There were processions to chapel, formal greetings, and the endless receiving of those who wished to be seen in a queen's company. Anne also understood the value of patronage. She supported scholars, clergy, and those whose learning or reforming sympathies aligned with her own interests. Books moved through her circle. So did men who believed the English Church should be cleansed of corruption and brought closer to Scripture. Her piety was real, though it did not always resemble the older style embodied by Catherine. Anne's religious life seems to have combined devotion with intellectual curiosity, and she showed interest in the reading of Scripture and in critics of clerical excess. This made her important not only as queen, but as a force within the changing religious climate of England. Her household became one of the places where reforming ideas found protection, conversation, and sometimes promotion. She gave alms, she heard sermons, She also involved herself, at least at times, in the advancement of men she favoured and in the soft influence that queens could exercise over church appointments and royal mercy. Influence at court did not always need a seal to be real. Henry's feelings towards her in these years still carried warmth. He had struggled long to make her queen, and for a time, that long pursuit still cast a glow over their marriage. They travelled from palace to palace as rulers did. Greenwich, Hampton Court, Whitehall, Eltham, and other royal houses received them with varying moods of river mist, autumn light, winter fire, or spring dampness. Each residence had its own sound. In one, there might be the splash of oars on the Thames. In another, the distant barking of hunting dogs. In another, the muted echo of steps under timbered roofs. Anne moved through these spaces with authority now. She entered chapels before bowing officials, sat at the centre of household order, and lived within rooms where every object had been arranged to speak of royal dignity. Yet queenship also demanded endurance. Pregnancy, recovery, expectation, ceremonial display, and the burden of constant observation could wear even the strongest spirit. There were those who admired her intelligence and quickness. There were also those who found her too sharp, too visible, or too closely associated with the pain caused to Catherine and Mary. Foreign ambassadors recorded these divisions with care. Their letters to their masters often described Anne not simply as a woman, but as a measure of England's changing weather. Some at court leaned toward her, hoping her favour would bring advancement. Others waited with cautious reserve, sensing that a queen raised by controversy might one day stand on uncertain ground. The common people are harder to hear clearly. Some accepted the new order because the king commanded it, while others kept older loyalties in private thought and prayer. That quiet division mattered. A crown shines brightest when it seems natural, and Anne's never fully acquired that calm simplicity in the minds of all her subjects. Still, the machinery of state worked to secure her place. Parliament passed the Act of Succession in 1534, recognizing the king's marriage to Anne and the rights of their daughter Elizabeth. Subjects were expected to acknowledge this arrangement. Oaths were demanded, language was altered, and the kingdom was pressed to align its conscience with the new shape of Tudor legitimacy. For some, this was possible. For others, it was not. A few men of high principle, among them Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, could not accept the changes required of them. Their refusal became part of the larger story of a kingdom in which law and faith were being forced into new relations. Anne did not direct every such event, and history has often placed too much or too little upon her shoulders. Yet she lived near the centre of them, and her queenship cannot be separated from the wider turning of England away from papal authority. The title that Henry now increasingly claimed was vast in implication. If the king stood as supreme head of the church in England, then the old path by which spiritual authority flowed through Rome had been altered. This did not instantly remake parish life. Bells still rang, priests still said mass, candles still burned before altars, and many familiar devotions continued. But the language of power had shifted. What had once been unthinkable was now written into law. Anne's place in this change gave her both strength and danger. She was no longer merely the desired woman at court, but one of the living symbols of a new order. In quiet hours, perhaps she felt the strain of that. Symbols are praised in public, but privately, they are expected to carry more than any one person can easily bear. Her daughter Elizabeth grew under close supervision. Wet nurses, rocking cradles, soft linen, silver cups, tiny garments, and the patient work of the nursery formed a small enclosed world within the larger turbulence of the kingdom. Anne seems to have taken pleasure in the child. If disappointment was voiced around the princess's sex, the baby herself was still a source of tenderness and hope. A daughter could be loved deeply, even if she could not satisfy the first political wish of the age. Anne had given the king a living heir, and that was no small thing in a dynasty not yet old. But time moved quickly. Another pregnancy was expected. The court looked toward the future with the fixed gaze of people who believe one more event may quiet every doubt. If a son came next, many hoped, the long years of turmoil might seem redeemed. Instead, uncertainty deepened. Anne became pregnant again, but one of these later pregnancies ended before fulfillment. The details remain less clear than the sorrow they imply. In royal households, disappointment was often wrapped in careful language, but everyone understood when a hoped-for cradle fell silent. Such losses were heavy in any marriage. In a royal marriage built so urgently upon succession, they carried an added shadow. Henry was not yet done hoping, nor surely was Anne. But the ease of early victory began to fade. A queen who had been lifted upward by expectation now lived beneath expectation's unending return. This altered the atmosphere of court. It did not break it at once, but it changed its music. Those who had watched Anne rise now watched to see whether she could remain secure. Her family stayed prominent, her household active, and her influence meaningful. Yet a slight unease had entered the spaces around her. At times, Anne and Thomas Cromwell seemed to have worked in broad sympathy, especially when older church structures were being questioned. Yet the alliance between them was never perfect. Cromwell thought in terms of policy, revenue, and institutional control. Anne appears to have cared more about patronage, reforming clergy, and perhaps the more charitable use of wealth taken from the church. These differences did not immediately become open hostility, but they formed one of the hidden lines of strain within the government surrounding Henry. The dissolution of the monasteries had begun to touch the kingdom in unsettling ways. Visitors were sent, reports made, and old religious houses that had long shaped local devotion and charity came under scrutiny. For many ordinary people, monasteries were not abstract institutions. They were familiar places of prayer, almsgiving, memory, and burial. Anne's own position in these matters was not simple. She could favor reform, and yet also be uneasy about how sacred wealth might be handled. At court, such distinctions were not always easy to preserve. Once power began to move through statute and confiscation, many motives gathered around it. There were still festive seasons. Christmas was observed with rich food, greenery, light, music, and the ordered pleasure of noble hospitality, there were still hunts, masks, and moments of outward harmony. Yet one senses, as the years pass, a slight cooling beneath the gold surfaces of Tudor life. Henry was growing older. Not old in the ordinary sense, but older than the radiant prince he had once been. His body, once known chiefly for athletic grace, began to carry more weight and pain. His moods, too, could darken more quickly when frustrated. A king who had long believed his will would secure a son now faced delay once more. Delay is hard for any man, and harder still for a ruler whose every success has taught him to expect obedience from time itself. Anne did not become meek under pressure. Reports from the period suggest that she could be spirited, sharp in speech, and unwilling to accept neglect in silence. This quality had once helped distinguish her. It may also have made later years more difficult. A queen who answers back can seem lively in a season of favor. In a season of disappointment, the same trait may be called troublesome. It would be easy to make too much of court gossip here. Many stories about Anne's temper or jealousy were written later by enemies or by those who enjoyed shaping women into cautionary tales. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, it seems likely that her marriage did not remain easy. The pressures around the royal bed, the repeated demands of succession, and the tensions of government could not be kept outside the private chamber forever. Another pregnancy brought renewed hope, and again that hope did not settle into lasting security. Each failed expectation left the future thinner than before. Henry's eye, which had once fastened so intently upon Anne, began slowly to shift. This did not happen all in a moment, and perhaps Anne herself sensed it before others spoke of it openly. At court, changes in affection are rarely invisible. A different pattern of attention, a softened tone toward another lady, a slight cooling of urgency, all can be read by those who live among ceremony. By the mid-1530s, a quieter figure had come into the king's view. Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies, seemed in many ways the opposite of the Queen in manner and reputation. Where Anne was remembered as brilliant and alert, Jane appeared gentle and composed. Whether this contrast was entirely fair matters less than the fact that people around the court began to notice it. Such noticing can be fatal in palaces. Once a comparison begins, it acquires its own life. Anne was still queen. She still held rank, still presided over her household, still had allies, and still occupied the place for which so much had been overturned. But the air was changing. Her enemies no longer seemed merely resentful. They began to look patient. In Tudor politics, patience could be more dangerous than anger. One source of Anne's deepest insecurity remained the same from the beginning. She had not yet given Henry the son that had justified, in his own mind, the long breaking of one marriage and the making of another. Her daughter Elizabeth continued to grow. The child's future should have been bright, yet it depended almost entirely on her mother's hold upon the king. That dependence gave everything a slight trembling quality. The nursery might be calm, but the kingdom around it was not. In 1535, Catherine of Aragon died. Her passing closed one chapter of sorrow, but it did not bring peace. For Anne, the death of her predecessor may have seemed to remove an old shadow. Yet the relief, if there was any, did not last. The same month and year also brought the fall of men who had resisted the royal supremacy. Executions for conscience darkened the moral atmosphere of the reign, even if the ceremonies of power continued unchanged. Anne's own image in the kingdom remained uncertain. To some, she was a patron of reform and learning. To others, she was still the woman for whom a beloved queen had been cast aside. Such divided memory left her with fewer safe places than a crowned woman might wish. The winter of 1535 and the opening of 1536 carried a colder mood. Fires burned in the palaces, but warmth did not easily settle in hearts grown weary. Another pregnancy seemed at first to promise renewal. Once more, hope turned toward the possibility of a prince. Then came loss again. In January 1536, Anne's pregnancy ended in sorrow, and this time the disappointment appears to have struck with unusual force. The child was said to have been a boy. Whether that detail was repeated with exactness or with later emphasis, the meaning at court was clear enough. The long-awaited answer had not come. After years of struggle, after laws, ceremonies, oaths, and reorders of rank, the central wish of the king remained unfulfilled. Henry's grief and frustration moved into a dangerous silence. He had not lost his power, but he had begun to lose his faith in the future he had built around Anne. And Anne must have felt this with painful clarity. She had once seemed the bright beginning of a new age. Now she stood in rooms that were still rich, still attended, still formally obedient, yet touched by a stillness that felt different from peace. It was the stillness that comes when favour hesitates. Jane Seymour's presence at court took on a new significance. So did Cromwell's calculations, the resentments of Anne's enemies, and the memories of all those who had never fully accepted her. The Queen still rose to prayer. She still dressed in royal cloth, still received those admitted to her chambers, still moved through the long forms of Tudor rank. But something had shifted inwardly. The crown remained on her head, while the confidence beneath it had begun to thin. Let us pause there in the winter light. Outside, the branches stand bare against a pale sky. The river runs dark beside the palace walls, and the bells mark the passing hours as they always do. Inside, candles are trimmed, logs settle in the hearth, and courtiers speak softly in corners where their words cannot quite be heard. The Queen is still alive within the centre of power, but the warmth around her has begun to fade, and the silence gathering at the edges of her world is no longer gentle. And when silence gathers for too long at court, it begins to invite decision. By the spring of 1536, the Queen, who had once seemed the promise of England's future, stood in a world that felt colder with each passing week. Henry's attention had turned with increasing steadiness toward Jane Seymour. she was presented to the court as modest, calm, and undemanding, and in such seasons of disappointment, those qualities could appear like a kind of shelter. Anne still wore the crown, yet the confidence that once surrounded her had thinned into something fragile, and those who had long waited in the shadows now sensed that the moment for action had come. Thomas Cromwell, once useful to Anne's rise, was no longer securely aligned with her interests. Policy, money, religion, royal favour, and private resentment had begun to twist together in ways that made the Queen increasingly vulnerable. In Tudor England, danger did not always arrive with noise. Often it entered through interviews, sealed papers, careful accusations, and the subtle change in how men looked at one another in council. Rumours moved first, then questions followed. Names were gathered, conversations were remembered or said to be remembered, and ordinary gestures were lifted out of their place and made to carry darker meaning. Among those drawn into the net were men of the King's Circle. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and the musician Mark Smeaton were accused alongside Anne, while her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was also named. The charges were grave and startling. They accused the Queen of adulterous relationships and of treason, charges that would have shaken any court, even if they had not touched the woman who had once altered the kingdom itself. Historians have long judged these accusations to be deeply doubtful. The dates, the circumstances, and the patterns of testimony do not rest easily together, and many have seen in the whole process a political destruction rather than a truthful inquiry. But in the spring of 1536, truth alone was not enough to protect anyone. Once the king's favour had turned away, the machinery of Tudor power could move with frightening smoothness. On the 2nd day of May, Anne was arrested. She'd been watching a tournament, or had been near the life of court as usual, when she was summoned and informed that she must go to the Tower. The journey by river carried its own solemn meaning. For some, the Tower was a ceremonial entrance into power, but for others it was a stone threshold into uncertainty, where the same walls that had sheltered kings could also hold their prisoners. As Anne moved along the Thames, the water would have reflected a pale sky and the softened outlines of the city. London, always busy, always murmuring, continued about its business, while one of its queens was carried toward confinement. The Tower of London had long stood at the edge of royal history. Its chambers, chapels, gates, and cold passages had seen coronations, imprisonments, births, plots, feasts, and endings, often within the same lifetime of stone. Anne knew those walls already. She had entered the Tower before as a queen preparing for her coronation, received with ceremony and expectation. Now she entered under a different sky. Memory must have followed her through the gate like a second shadow. Accounts from the time suggest that she was shaken, bewildered, and at moments desperate to understand what precisely had been laid against her. Yet even in distress, she seems to have spoken with flashes of clarity, as though the mind still sought order, while the world around it became unreal. She was lodged in the royal apartments within the Tower. The irony was quiet and severe. These were not bare cells in the ordinary sense. They were rooms touched by rank, but rank could do little when the door was watched and the future sealed elsewhere. From the windows, she may have seen patches of sky, walls warmed briefly by spring light, and perhaps the motion of boats beyond. The river remained close, moving with the same calm indifference it had always shown to the passing troubles of kings and queens. Inside, the hours slowed. Servants attended in reduced number, guards remained near, and the routine of prayer, questioning, waiting, and sleepless thought took the place of courtly ceremony. The men accused with her were also imprisoned. Their names, once spoken in hunting fields and palace chambers, were now spoken in legal language and in anxious whispers across the kingdom. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, became especially significant to the case. He confessed to misconduct with the Queen, though the circumstances of that confession remain deeply troubling and have led many to suspect pressure, fear, or coercion. What Anne knew of these unfolding statements, and in what order she learned them, is not always clear, but she would have understood soon enough that the circle around her was tightening and that the charges were being arranged into a pattern designed to destroy. Her brother George was among those accused. That fact gave the whole matter an added chill, because it transformed the proceedings from personal ruin into something that struck at the heart of family itself. For Anne, this must have been one of the most painful parts of the ordeal. Brother and sister had risen together in the favor of the court, and now both stood caught in the same dark design. On the 12th of May, the first trials were held at Westminster. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were condemned. Then, on the 15th of May, Anne and George were tried within the Tower itself. A jury of peers was assembled, and the forms of justice were observed with all the outward dignity that Tudor law could provide. Yet form is not the same as fairness. The verdict had the stillness of something long prepared. Anne defended herself with intelligence and firmness. Contemporary reports suggest that she answered the charges clearly and carried herself with a composure that impressed even some who believed her doomed. She was nevertheless found guilty. In that moment, the Queen, who had once stood at Westminster crowned in cloth of gold, became, in law, a traitor condemned to die. It is difficult to imagine the inward stillness that follows such a sentence. A person may hear the words, understand them, and yet feel as if the air itself has altered in a way the body cannot at once accept. George Boleyn was executed 2 days later, on the 17th of May. The other accused men died before him or on the same day, their lives ending beneath the authority of the king they had served. Anne remained in the Tower after the sentence. The spring days continued to pass, one after another, bright in places, cool in others, while within the walls everything narrowed toward a single appointed morning. These last days have lingered in memory because of the calm she seems, at times, to have recovered. People under sentence do not always become still, but Anne appears to have moved between sorrow, prayer, courage, and a kind of lucid resignation. She made confession. She received the sacrament. In a world shaped so deeply by Christian ritual, these acts mattered with profound tenderness. They brought the condemned back into a sacred order, even when the earthly order had turned against them. She also spoke with the constable of the tower and with those attending her. Some remembered moments of emotion, even flashes of strained laughter or restless speech. But beneath these scattered reports, one senses a woman trying to steady herself before the end. Henry, meanwhile, moved away from her with extraordinary speed. Before Anne's death, arrangements were already advancing that would clear the path for marriage to Jane Seymour. This swift turn has remained one of the harshest truths of the story. Tudor kingship allowed little room for lingering sentiment once usefulness had ended. And yet Anne's final hours were marked not by the noise of court, but by enclosure and prayer. The world that had once swirled around her in silk, music, and political urgency had shrunk to stone walls, chapel words, and the closeness of a few attendants. There was one small mercy in the manner chosen for her death. A skilled swordsman was brought from Calais, rather than using the more common axe. This detail has often been remembered because it suggests a final gesture of favour, or perhaps of efficiency, from a king who had already resolved to erase one marriage and begin another. Even here, Tudor power remained ceremonial. On the morning of the 19th of May, Anne was brought to the scaffold within the tower. The space was smaller and more private than the great public places of punishment, and those present stood close beneath the pale light of an English morning. She was dressed carefully. Even at the threshold of death, clothing, order, and composure still mattered. Witnesses described her as controlled and dignified. She spoke briefly, not accusing the king, but acknowledging him according to the conventions expected, and commending her soul to God. Such speeches in Tudor England were shaped by ritual as much as by personal feeling. Yet within the form, her words seem to have carried sincerity, humility, and the last effort of a woman determined to meet her end with steadiness. Then her life was brought quietly to its close. The moment itself need not be dwelt upon. What followed was stillness. The noise of controversy, so loud in life, fell suddenly away. Her body was placed in a simple chest prepared in haste and buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the tower precincts. There, among stone and prayer, she was laid to rest without the grand monuments that usually attend a queen. She was not yet 35, and perhaps not even 30. The exact number remains uncertain, as so much in her life remains partly veiled. Before the month ended, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. The court adjusted itself once more, because courts are made to continue. Pages were turned, titles were altered. Cloth was changed in royal chambers, new servants took their places, and the kingdom was instructed to look toward a new queen, and once again toward the hope of a son. The speed of it gave Anne's fall a kind of unreal sharpness, as though one season had been folded away before its weather had fully passed. Princess Elizabeth, Anne's little daughter, was declared illegitimate. Like Mary before her, she was pushed out of the line of certainty and made to inhabit a diminished place in her father's household. This was one of the cruelest inheritances Anne left behind, though she did not choose it. The child in the nursery, once proclaimed as the answer to a kingdom's hopes, now grew in the half-light of uncertainty. And yet, history did not end where the scaffold stood. The daughter of Anne Boleyn remained alive, and with her remained possibilities that no one in May of 1536 could fully see. Henry's reign continued through more marriages, more changes, and more sorrow. Jane Seymour gave him the son he desired, the future Edward VI, but she herself died soon after childbirth, and the king's household turned again through new queens and fresh rearrangements of loyalty. The religious changes that had accelerated during Anne's rise did not disappear with her death. England had already been drawn far from its old obedience to Rome, and the crown's supremacy over the church in the realm remained one of the defining facts of the age. Monasteries continued to fall. Their bells were silenced, their lands taken, and their ancient rhythms of prayer broken apart under royal policy. For ordinary people, these changes were often more immediate than the memory of one queen's fate. Stone cloisters, local shrines, treasured images, and inherited forms of devotion slowly vanished or were transformed. Yet Anne's name remained woven into this larger turning. To some, she became a patron of reform cut down before her work could ripen. To others, she remained the ambitious woman whose rise had brought pain to a lawful queen and division to the realm. Memory, like court favor, did not speak with one voice. Princess Elizabeth grew through these years with caution around her. She was educated carefully, learned languages, read deeply, and acquired a disciplined intelligence that would later astonish many who served her. In this child, one may glimpse something of both parents. There was Henry's command, perhaps, but also Anne's quickness, education, and inward alertness. When Henry died in 1547, England passed first to Edward VI, then to Mary I. Only after many further changes, and after years in which Elizabeth herself knew danger and uncertainty, did Anne's daughter at last ascend the throne in 1558. That moment cast a long light backward. The daughter once set aside became Queen Elizabeth I, and under her rule England entered one of the most remembered reigns in its history. Elizabeth did not restore her mother's life, nor could she erase the sorrows that had marked her own childhood. But by living, ruling, and enduring, she gave Anne's story a future no one at the Tower scaffold could have imagined. The queen who had died in disgrace became, through her daughter, an ancestor of English greatness. Memory softened in some places and sharpened in others. Writers, chroniclers, diplomats, poets, and later historians all returned to Anne with different questions. Was she victim, schemer, reformer, temptress, martyr, political player, devoted mother, or some mixture too human to be contained by any single name? The answer has shifted from age to age. Each generation has seemed to find in her a different reflection of its own concerns. Some have admired her intelligence and courage. Some have blamed her for the ruin of Catherine. Some have looked at the evidence and seen a woman destroyed because she ceased to satisfy the need that had once raised her up. Others have seen the workings of a court where everyone lived too close to a king whose favor was indistinguishable from fate. perhaps that is why Anne Boleyn remains so difficult to lay quietly in the past. Her life sits at the meeting place of intimacy and power. She was not merely a queen in a portrait. She was a daughter of a rising family, a girl shaped by Hever, by continental courts, by prayer, by books, by music, by ambition, and by the dangerous brilliance of Tudor ceremony. She entered English history through rooms lit by candles and ruled by ritual. She left it beneath the same dynasty's unblinking logic, where queens could be crowned in splendor and buried in haste. Yet the afterlife of memory is gentler than the court that once judged her. In the centuries that followed, people kept returning to her, not because her story was simple, but because it felt unfinished. And perhaps in a way it was. Her child survived. Her influence on the religious direction of England did not wholly vanish, and the world she had moved through remained forever marked by the years when Henry sought to make her queen. If we step back now from the tower, the river is still there. It carries light in the morning and shadow at evening, just as it did when Anne first approached those walls in triumph and later entered them in sorrow. The chapels of Tudor England are quieter now. The candles that once burned for Catherine, for Anne, for Jane, for kings and infants, and the dead of noble houses, have long since gone out. But history keeps a low ember of its own. It glows in old letters, worn stone steps, chapel floors, embroidered names, and the patient work of remembering those who moved through the fragile theatre of power. So Anne Boleyn remains with us not only as the queen who lost her head, but as a woman of the Tudor twilight. She belongs to the hush of Hever, the grace of France, the long corridors of Henry's court, the prayers of the Tower, and the distant future carried in the life of Elizabeth. And now, as the palace lamps grow dim in memory, and the river slips on through the dark, her story settles at last into stillness. The halls are quiet, the bells are far away, and the restless world that once gathered around her has faded into the soft, enduring night of history. The court is quiet now. The candles burn low, the bells are far away, and the story settles gently into the dark. If you'd like, you can close your eyes here and simply rest. Thank you for listening tonight. May your rest be peaceful and your night be calm.